So I'd just like to start off by acknowledging the Turrbal and Yagara people as the traditional custodians on the lands we're on today, and I think something incredibly powerful about Indigenous Australians is they've used stories to transcend knowledge over thousands of years and hundreds of generations. And I think today, with what I'll talk to the humans of agriculture and share a little bit of my journey, hopefully you can understand maybe the importance of stories, and hopefully there probably won't be too many facts will actually maybe hit you in the feels. So in terms of the humans of ag story, and just starting off with it, in 2019 I was in South Africa and I was over there for my brother's wedding. I'd spent a fair bit of time on farms and around agriculture in Australia, but you go over to developing countries and you see affluence and extreme poverty living side by side. And I had this cab driver. He was a fella from Zimbabwe, and we got chatting and he asked what I did. At the time I was working on a farm here in Australia, and he mentioned that his lifelong ambition was that he wanted to become a farmer, send his money home, own his block of land, grow some livestock and produce enough food to feed his family. And I think what he was talking about was his dream was to be a farmer but live in subsistence. And I think at the same time here in Australia and even today, we have conversations that if we actually broaden our perspectives and understand other people's ideas and where they're coming from, it can be incredibly powerful for us. If we look at ag broadly, in a global context, 28% of the world's population rely on ag, derive their income from ag. 7.7 billion people are relying on it every single day. When it comes to the imbalances of agriculture, you've got 2 billion people living overweight and 832 million people every single day going hungry. Off the back of that, what Annalene was talking about before was also the number of children and people that will live a life impoverished because they actually don't have access to adequate nutrition. So when it comes to humans of ag and what we're doing, I believe that agriculture, particularly in Australia, has been an incredibly humble industry, but as Bryce and others were leading to and chatting to before, agriculture actually has an opportunity to step into a role of leadership which the world's craving. And hopefully I can share a little bit more about our journey with you today. So I'm actually, well, firstly I probably need to front up. I'm definitely not an influencer. We've got a little platform and podcast, but I grew up in Sydney. I've gone full circle. I still live in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. Sometimes I'll even have a flat white in Bondi of the mornings before working in ag for the day. But I've always been a country kid at heart, and I'd spend my school holidays at my uncle's property down in Victoria, riding motorbikes, chasing sheep. But it was a fella by the name of Dave Kinimont that gave me my first shot. And as a 12-year-old, I was down there. Dave asked, he was doing just a bit of drafting actually, and he said, "Oh, Albie, can I borrow Ollie for the weekend?" I think he might have given me $50. So to a 12-year-old, it sounded pretty good. But what Dave showed me about the industry more broadly is that agriculture is incredibly accepting. If people are willing to give it a go, and even sometimes run to get a gate, that will welcome them with open arms and give them opportunity. And I think a lot of what I do and where that passion for the industry comes from is from people like Dave, who's actually probably just a lot like many of the people in the room here today. But I've been faced with this consistent question, which I actually got asked as a 16-year-old, and there might be some common themes if you listen to our podcast. I believe that students, young kids, 16, 17 years old, are incredibly influenced, and the impact of people not actually having a greater understanding of agriculture is affecting our industry. So one of my best friends, played rugby with him since I was 6 years old. He asked me in year 10 when we were looking at subjects, agriculture was seen as a blood subject, and if you're even thinking of doing it at university, it was just unheard of. And so we've got this perception in terms of what agriculture is that people actually don't even understand what happens in our sector day to day. So I've had this burning desire since I was 16 years old, which surprisingly is nearly half my life now, to actually redefine what agriculture is. And I think through using storytelling, sharing people who are involved in the everyday of agriculture, we can actually redefine what our sector is. I think we can make ag a sector which is the industry of choice, but actually then also breeding leaders for other sectors that many people can aspire to be part of. So in the theme of being brave, I've got this shocking photo that I thought I'd put up. But in terms of my background, I've got no media qualifications. I studied a Bachelor of Agribusiness at Marcus Oldham. I've got no experience in front of camera. I guess I'm just passionate about what I do and interested in understanding a little bit more about agriculture. I'm probably actually just that 5-year-old kid that's growing up, still quite childish in some respects, and just keep asking why, because I'm just curious and want to know more. But I think that question around agriculture has really followed me And in 2015, after my second stint at trying to get back into uni, I wrote this on one of my scholarship applications. They asked what our envisaged career in agriculture was, and I think with some of the people I've spoken to, the likes of Kari Moffat, a huge part of getting somewhere is actually putting it out in the ether and kind of following this pathway of actually maybe you are where you're supposed to be. And so I think in terms of where I am today, I still think we've got a huge gap in Australian agriculture in terms of how we communicate necessary information. And I hope that I'm on the pathway to actually supporting others to be leaders in this as well. In terms of, there's three kind of key problems, and this is about as far as my facts will get today. In terms of the first one being community perceptions of ag, and we saw it with the likes of the MLA and everyone else. We've seen a generational shift in agriculture move away, so 83% of Australians have a distant or non-existent connection to agriculture. Off the back of that, we've got some internal conversations we need to have as well. 65% of farmers are concerned about the reputation of the sector within Australia, and 77% believe that mainstream media doesn't actually represent what happens in ag. And so in that tiny little area where those three circles join, I reckon that's the opportunity for humans of ag. So we've created a media business, I guess. It makes me feel quite uncomfortable in saying that. But it can actually work from within industry, sharing the stories of the people who are involved in our everyday and actually try and tap into that broader audience as well. Does anyone know who this fella is here? His name's Brandon Stanton, and he started something called Humans of New York. He would walk around the streets of New York with his camera and he'd chat to everyday New Yorkers. He'd sit down with his camera, nothing prepared, and he'd squat down and ask them a few questions. Firstly, he'd say, "Do you mind if I have a chat to you?" Then he would start to get these people talking about their lives, complete strangers, and somehow Brandon was able to connect with people who he'd never met before. People would start to open up about their adversities, their challenges, grief, loss, love, everything else that made them who they were. And all you had to do was be interested. In borrowing some of Brandon's ideas, and I've borrowed a quote off him as well, because I certainly don't read Abraham Lincoln. But reading serves to teach that all my original thoughts weren't so original after all. That's what Abraham Lincoln said way back then. And in terms of what I'm trying to do with Humans of Agriculture, it's absolutely not original at all. We saw what could work with Brandon in terms of getting people talking about their passions and who they are and why they do what they do. So why can't we just apply it to agriculture? And so back at the beginning of 2019, I started Humans of Ag as a website, as social media channels. And I wanted to talk and understand for myself, but also for our audience, how is agriculture done today and how can it be done in the future in more sustainable and better ways? And so I think the easy part that I kind of believed from the very beginning was that, the industry will actually just champion, it'll become really easy to just share stories, everyone's going to front up, and we'll just start to tap into this broader community that have this disconnect. It was actually probably the other side of things. The broader community is actually incredibly interested in what happens in agriculture in rural Australia. If we start to talk about the people who are actually involved in the day-to-day, their authentic experiences, what actually happens, what you guys would seem as extremely or extraordinary is actually extraordinary to other people. And so I think we've started to move along this pathway where hopefully people are starting to become a little bit more comfortable with sharing their story with us. But even last week I was chatting with one of the banks and their clients were in the room, and I asked them how many people would be comfortable fronting up to the media and sharing their story, who they are, what they do, opening their gates. And about 50% of the people in the room actually said that they'd be willing to do it because they'd been burned. And so I think for us as an industry, the opportunity for us is actually to come from the inside to the out and take our stories to people on the outside. In terms of our journey, I've had an incredible amount of learnings. It started off really just as a hobby and a passion project, and for me, it evolved. So it started off just doing written stories, then we moved into the podcast, which is probably how most people know us today, and then from there we've moved now into video. So I can chat to, I guess, just some of the fundamentals. We've had people talking about influencers. I have no intentions of being an influencer or anything like that. I actually want Humans of Ag as the platform to be the influencer. So if you think if we've got people from all different sectors of ag, but all across the value chain as well, actually sharing their stories through one platform, that one platform actually becomes a really powerful communicator, but actually our goal was to share 10,000 stories of people in ag. So we'll grow the audience through Humans of Agriculture, through our various means, but actually the everyday person becomes our influencer. So slightly different to what others are doing. It's certainly not revolutionary. But the fundamental thing for us was always to focus on creating interesting content and making sure that we never ever handed over the licenses to anyone if they wanted to pay us to do it. And so when we're working with people today, we're doing sponsored content, so we work with some incredible organisations, but basically they give us the keys to their business. I think it's pretty cool actually. We did it with Morton Co earlier on in the year, and it was like a reverse interview. I walked in, I sat down with Charlie, I interviewed him, found out a little bit about him, chatted to Stephen, chatted to Lily, and then we went out to the feedlot and kind of just learned about it from the ground up, and we'll show you a bit more of that shortly. And I guess in terms of probably like where Brandon started with his stories, the things which I didn't actually expect along the journey was, it's been incredibly humbling to just see the likes of, I've shared the podcast with the likes of Anasphere, I've shared various other CEOs, I've shared farmers, I've shared friends, but I think when people are willing to trust you and actually talk about grief and loss and succession, suicide, mental health, all these actual challenges which we live every single day, when you start to have these conversations and put them out into the real world, it can do extraordinary things for other people. In terms of defining a human of ag, so this is if I was to make up a Google page, this is what it would look like. So a human of agriculture, or humans of agriculture, is a collective group of people committed to bettering themselves and the world around them through their influence on producing, moving and consuming sustainable food. And of late I've actually changed it to sustainable fashion as well, because I think if we actually shift how we talk, language is incredibly important. I set out with a bit of a vision from the very beginning, and it's probably been one of the most daunting things in terms of, aspirations versus reality, and the amount of people that have probably shot me down in terms of how can one person aspire to do that. But I think all we're doing is starting the conversation. But if we look at where agriculture is placed, and touching on my points at the very beginning, that ag as an industry can create a world that's healthier, happier and more prosperous, and we are in an incredibly unique situation in where the world's heading to now. So in terms of redefining agriculture, when you think of people normally in agriculture, you probably don't think of chefs, startup CEOs, nutritionists, but we're actually looking to go across the supply chain. And so I reached out to the likes of Elsie. She's a girl from Brisbane, now working up near Gundy, I believe. And then people like Georgia Beattie, Mark LeBroy from Three Blue Ducks, and I'll touch on Mark's piece, but it was all about how do we shift the narrative and the stigma of who's actually a person involved in agriculture to what are just some of the diverse and vast opportunities that our sector can provide. In terms of how we've moved, and so today, still makes me very uncomfortable saying we're a business, but we are. I've moved out into it full time as of May this year. So that was probably one of the very scary things. But we're a grassroots agriculture media business. We're about sharing the stories of what actually happens in our sector, taking it to people who are involved in agriculture, but also people who are interested in ag, and going across the supply chain as well as up and down. As I said, we've created this influencer model, but how we do it is through providing content which people can read, that people can watch, and that they can listen to. The very first podcast I did was with Mark back in at the beginning of 2020, and for me, to be honest, if COVID hadn't have happened, Humans of Ag wouldn't exist today. I probably would have gone and done other more fun things. But I was living down in Melbourne, and I had the chance to chat with Mark LeBroy in February of 2020. And what Mark taught me as a chef who'd been involved in this sustainable food movement for so long, he was serving up food in his in Byron Bay, in Bronte, and in his other restaurants. And he was telling me that it was so important for him to understand everything that happened down the supply chain. That you probably don't think of a chef as being a person involved in agriculture, but for him, he said it was absolutely critical that he knew where he was getting it from, because as a chef, he puts his heart and soul into everything he puts forward. And so if it wasn't right, if the food wasn't produced to be highly nutritious, it would ruin his end product. He'd have people come into the into the restaurant, and if people said, oh, can you tell us a little bit more about the food on the plate, he had to know that information. And then he also talked about just the changing nature of the consumer as well. Some people would come in and want to know absolutely everything, and others would come in and they just were there looking to have a meal with some friends and actually had no interest in what was happening. So I just want to touch on the power of individuals sharing their story. This is Jazz. I've actually never met her. We've chatted a few times, but Jazz is based, or she was based up in Western Australia when I was chatting to her. And in terms of, Jazz chatted about being a 19-year-old girl who was completely lost, didn't know what to do. She had friends working in agriculture. But it wasn't until she started to see a little bit more content about governessing up on stations that she then decided, you know what, I'm going to ditch this cafe job in Sydney and I'm going to head up there. And so Jazz has gone up, she's got a love of photography, and she's actually, hopefully next year, going to do a lap around Australia, taking photos as a rural photographer, which is incredible. But one of the things I probably haven't touched on is around the fear that I had in terms of turning up and sharing my story. And I think it's a common misconception that we have that if you put yourself out there, you'll probably get shot down. And I think what really stuck with me from Jazz's piece was just the amount of people that had either lost touch with her, had no touch with her, but was actually able to resonate with her story, and the positivity that came through her story was absolutely incredible. In terms of the power of stories, so this fellow, his name's Ricky Proles, some of you may know him, but Ricky was working on a station. He'd been working his absolute guts out, and his car was playing up, and he'd got a bit of engine oil on his dry-as-a-bone jacket. Anyway, he'd fallen asleep next to a fire and an ember landed on his jacket and it started to smoulder. He woke up with the dry-as-a-bone zip melted, and the next thing he knew, he was in hospital. And Ricky's story, it was about 400 words. Within 48 hours of us posting it, it had over 250,000 people read it. It had several thousand people share it. And this is the power of authentic stories that are actually happening and part of our everyday. But what Ricky's story actually underlined was just the incredible resilience of people in our sector. He was told that because of the extent of his burns, he would never ever work on a station again. And he said his number one goal was that he wanted to get back to working on the station. His second goal was he wanted to become a chopper pilot. And so a couple of years on from his accidents, Ricky's now a chopper pilot working through Queensland, and I'm sure some people in the room know him. I'll run through just very quickly some of the platforms we're on. We use Instagram fairly predominantly to engage with with the broader community. It's very much about showing people just the background, sharing these stories of the likes of Ricky, of Jazz. We then have a Facebook page and Facebook private group. The private group's probably more focused in terms of like a forum for people within ag. We then use LinkedIn for for trying to attract a little bit more interest from corporates and other people in agriculture who could potentially support us. And I think in terms of just the messaging, we're never just running with one story across one platform. There's probably three key things that we think of before we post any form of content or share a story. And it's who are we talking to, what are the key messages we're trying to get across, and actually why should they care? If we can answer those three things really succinctly in a couple of sentences, we can actually create some really powerful stories. So in terms of our community, we're predominantly younger, so we've got a touch over 33,000 people across the different platforms. 85% of people are under the age of 45, 69% are under the age of 35, and probably incredibly uniquely, and I think for us in terms of where agriculture is heading, in terms of progress, 66% of our audience are female. And I think that is in a stark imbalance to where the rest of agriculture and the sector sits. In terms of our podcasts, so similar stats, still got the younger audience tuning in. We're getting pretty good listenership across the board, and we've got about 15,500 people tuning in every month now. So in terms of the numbers, I think it's actually extraordinary now that I think that we're having several conversations and people are then taking this into their lives and running with it. In terms of where we started, so the stories are obviously incredibly important, but now this shift into being a media business in agriculture, and short form media is absolutely taking over. So we're still doing our stories. That's the part that I love, and just I get so much out of sitting down with our different people. But in other sectors of media, things are taking off. So the Daily Oz now, we've tried it on a few posts, but the Daily Oz It's designed for younger people. In about 8 slides on an Instagram post, you can get at a high level across the information that you should probably know as an everyday Australian. So we're releasing a podcast around that. It's going to be no longer than 15 minutes, one, because I don't want to make too much extra work for myself, but in terms of how do we actually tackle topics. And so if I look at some of the frustrations I've got in agriculture, there used to be books which were like Carbon Mechanics for Dummies, but across the industry, we're talking about carbon neutral targets by 2030. And I actually think, maybe prove me wrong, but there's very few people that actually understand what's the difference between a carbon credit, what's the difference between a biodiversity credit, where do I get started, and then actually how do I even use that in the value chain. So how do we take these conversations back? Every other sector's doing it. Finance does it really well in terms of taking people on the learning journey, starting off at the base floor, explaining the fundamentals to people, and then taking them on that journey. If we can create that content in short snippets, then people can actually come back to the very beginning when they join that and actually learn along the way. So I think for us, that's a huge opportunity. How do we get people who are very time poor in the know on the go? You don't need to become experts in it, but you need to actually have a basic understanding of some of these key areas. I'm going to start a video. So earlier this year, it was actually our first main video. We headed up to Morton Co. So I'll share this video with you, but I think this is, in terms of storytelling, this piece has had over 200,000 views on it. It's about a minute and a half long. It doesn't talk about any facts. It talks about someone talking about what makes them passionate, why they care. And there's a few key words that kind of come through as part of this, so enjoy.
My name's Chelsea. I'm a pen rider here at Mort, and I've been here just over 3 years now. Come here early, we start in the dark and we saddle up some horses and we come out and ride some pens and check some cattle. And I mean, we're just looking for anything that's out of the ordinary. Welfare's our biggest thing out here. We're such a big feedlot, we should be setting the standards for everything, and that's with our cattle health and welfare. Our big thing every day is we have to walk through them, and you stand every beast up, so you get to look at every beast and make sure everything's looking at me. I mean, if something's not looking at me, then, I mean, usually there's something wrong with that beast. And then we like to walk in and you check both the troughs and make sure they're clean, and you'll walk up and check the bunk, make sure they're eating, and you check that everything's weight bearing and everything's happy, make sure that the troughs are clean, that their bunk's slick, and take your time. Like, the biggest thing is that we take our time because we care.
But one thing I can't get over, and I'm kind of blown away by, is just how quiet it is here. I was definitely not expecting them to be as calm and as quiet as what they are. Is that just because they're so used to having people around them all the time?
I think also they're content, that they want for nothing. They've got a feed laid out for them every day that's, had more nutritional science gone into it than what we put down our throats. They've got fresh water, pens are kept clean, plentiful shade available, and they're checked on daily and interacted with. All our cattle handling is all about low stress cattle handling techniques, and so at the end of the day I think we've got happy cattle.
So I think in terms of some of the key takeaways, and what absolutely blew me away, I spent a bit of time around cattle yards and sale yards and whatnot, but I actually just could not get over how quiet the cattle were. And I think this is probably the things which is just, as I said earlier, what's part of your ordinary is actually extraordinary to the other people. And there was no facts in there, there was nothing else, but actually people who have followed that and watched that piece of content actually can resonate and gain an understanding over what's happening in the sector through the likes of Chelsea. And how many other people like Chelsea are in the room here today? So in terms of where to for us next, so we started off creating these little written pieces. I then decided I'd throw myself out there and start a podcast. Now we're moving into the video space. Well, I think we've got an incredible opportunity to work with businesses within agriculture to actually share the story of what happens in ag. And so for us, there is landlines and others out there, and there is landlines, there is influencers, there's plenty of other ways to get out there, and I think we're just another piece of that puzzle. We're coming at it, we're learning alongside our audience, and I think the results that we're starting to have is pretty extraordinary. And I think all it is at the end of the day is people talking about who they are, what they do, and what they care about. So for us, I jumped out at the beginning of May. We're now trying to hire, which is pretty exciting and scary. To be honest, it's the first time I've had sleepless nights, actually. about the whole thing. I don't know how you guys do it with what you do every single day. But in terms of, if anyone in the room wants to find out a little bit more about Humans of Ag, if you want to share your story, if you think there's opportunities in the broader lot feeding business or beef more broadly, or whatever operations you come from, I'd love to chat to you. And the other part is creating this membership area. I think we've got awesome opportunity to show people what a careers in agriculture looking like and start to shift up what a job position description looks like when we're promoting jobs. I think through our Facebook page we can start to have incredible forums and conversations, as well as in-person events. So if I come back to that question that I got asked as a 16-year-old in terms of what is the future in agriculture, I actually think it's a statement today, and it's why the future is in agriculture. We've got so much to be excited about. We've got so many extraordinary people. For me, I'm just incredibly lucky that I get the front row seat to sit down with them and ask them often some really dumb questions. But I think if we pick some themes over the last few days, Anna talking about storytelling and how crucial it is to the sector, there's also this idea that we don't really know where to get started. And so it's literally just throwing your hand up, getting involved. Terry Nolan talked about earlier in terms of humanising the sector. Well, I think that can take us an incredibly long way if we actually talk about people as people. And in terms of storytelling, to grow people's understanding of what happens in ag, I think it's ours to grab the bull by the horns. We have the story amongst us. It's on us sharing. We can have influences and everything else as part of it, but honestly, nothing beats authenticity and vulnerability. It's the trend. It's what's happening across sports. It's happening across business. And I think for us as a sector, if we can embrace that, it'll be incredibly powerful for us.